Let's go. Well, g'day everyone, and welcome to week number 8 here on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. Say hello to Ebony, everyone.
Hi.
As I mentioned at the start, one of the things I'd like to do here in these tutorials is occasionally bring in a guest who is doing this challenge with us. I'm thrilled that you are undertaking this journey, and Ebony has just finished her week 7 reading, so I thought I'd grab her before we head into our tutorial today. Well, last week, if you are keeping up to date with us, we've finished off the book of Leviticus. You've just done that, and started the book of Numbers, where we've finally left Egypt on our way to the promised land, but not quite. Something goes wrong in Numbers 11, 12, 13, and there's a pause button put on the plan to enter the promised land for about 40 years, which is a bit depressing. But anyway, before we get into our week's tutorial, I want to ask you a few questions, pretty standard questions. How are you doing your readings? What last week was your main takeaway, and what really has interested you in your reading? So how are you approaching your Bible readings first?
Okay, so my Bible readings, I'm approaching a little bit randomly, so just here and there when I have time. So I'm not like a get up early in the morning and do it all late at night. It's literally whenever I have free time. I've been handwriting all of my notes because I'm a handwriter.
Like you're writing notes for every chapter?
Well, for every chapter at the moment, because I started uni only 2 weeks ago, which means the last couple of months I haven't had to do any study, which means I have had time to go and do chapter by chapter, which will probably stop in the next few months. And then I've been reading this alongside my Bible reading. It's called the Infographic Bible, and it's super sick, and it has heaps of different diagrams and stuff that's been really helpful. So this, as an example, hopefully it's in the camera, it's the camps of Israel, and every human is 1,000 men in this diagram, which is cool. And then there's different, like they've got the ark and the tabernacle, they had all the sacrifices, the sacrificial system. Probably can't see the whole book there, but it's been really helpful.
That is cool.
Yeah, it's pretty sick.
And you know what they say about the camp? Like it's, you know, you've got the sanctuary in the middle, because this is what we're up to in the book of Numbers, and then they camped on north, south, east and west. And the idea is if you had a drone and you were to have a look at it from on top, it looks like a cross. Looks like a cross.
Yeah, it's so cool.
And even when you look at the some of the tribes are larger than the others, so it literally would be a cross. It wouldn't be perfectly even.
Yeah. It's pretty sick to visualize it. Yeah.
And last week, Leviticus, starting Numbers, what's your sort of takeaway, or what's really interested you?
Well, I think my main takeaway is just how much we restrict ourselves because of our unbelief in God, and how often we can see humans as so strong, even though we've got a God who can help us defeat anything that comes towards us. So that's probably the main takeaway, is how much we're held back by our own disbelief.
And so that's really the story there of where we ended last week, of the 10 spies versus the Caleb and Joshua, the 2 spies.
Yeah, totally. Numbers,
Okay, that really is a classic story. And as I mentioned today in this tutorial, that is also, it's a story that's revisited by Psalms and prophets and New Testament authors. It's a really critical story. And that's kind of why I wanted to end there last week, to have that etched in our mind, that story.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And have you done any other research or anything interesting like that?
I did have
Besides writing your own commentary?
No, I haven't. I've just written overviews.
Okay.
I thought it was interesting in Numbers 13, it's talking about Joshua, who is under Moses' leadership, basically. And Joshua ends up being a big character in the Bible later. And I didn't realise that he was under Moses' leadership as his aide. So that was cool. And then it just talks about his name change. So I'm going to butcher the name pronunciations, but it's Hoshea, which means salvation. So that's his original name. And then it was changed to Yehoshua. So there was an extra syllable added there, which means Yahweh is salvation, which is sick. And then you find out that later on, Yeshua is a shortening of Yehoshua. So Joshua and Jesus actually shared the same name, which is so cool. Yeah, that was my extra reading.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And what we find out through the Bible is that a lot of names have Yah in them. And so it's bringing Yahweh, it's bringing God's name into that. Even Moses' mum was named Jochebed, which means glory. Kebed is glory, and Yah means the glory of Yahweh. So yeah, a lot of names. Isaiah, Jeremiah, okay?
Yeah.
A lot of those names have
Yeah.
that. Awesome. Thanks for joining us.
That's all good.
All right, done. See you later. All right, here we go, guys. Welcome back to week number 8. As we head into our readings, we're going to be finishing the book of Numbers this week after the Joshua and Caleb story. And that's it. We're finishing Numbers, really. That's it. We're just in the one book this week, so it's super easy. I'll put a reading plan down in the notes for you if you're interested in that to have the main blocks. But what I thought with this tutorial would be good to do is, because we're just focusing on Numbers, is to give you a bit of an idea of the book of Numbers as a whole. So we're going to start there, and then I'll focus on our readings this week. All right. So basically, the reason we call this the book of Numbers is because of the census right at the start and the census at the end of the book. Because the first census is about the people that came out of Egypt. The last census is the people 40 years later, or 38 years later, who are now going to go into the promised land when that generation died off because of the Joshua and Caleb story. Okay, so 2 censuses, whatever. That's why we call the book of Numbers the book of Numbers. But what's interesting is that Hebrew speaking people, or the Jewish Bible, calls this book In the Wilderness. Okay, that's actually the original Jewish name for this book, is In the Wilderness, because at the end of the day, that's the main thing that happens in this story, and also it's named after the first significant word of the book, but that's a whole other thing you can geek out on if you like. But basically, the book of Numbers, the whole book, is divided really, or I'd like you to see it in 3 main sections according to 3 main locations in the story. The first one is Mount Sinai, where we've basically been since, Exodus 19, a year ago. We've been camped here at Mount Sinai. And the first 10 chapters, I spoke about it last week, first 10 chapters are basically there at Sinai, where they do their first census, conscription for the army, how they camp around the sanctuary, etc., etc. So the first thing is Mount Sinai. Then for 2 chapters, they travel. Okay, and in that travelling time, there's a lot of whinging, whining and complaining that goes on, and because of that, covenant curses come on God's people. So that happens in that period until they get to basically the wilderness. All right, chapters 13 through to 19 is based here in the wilderness, and that starts with the 10 spies story with Joshua and Caleb, and basically has a whole lot of other curses that come and complaining that comes, but because of God's people's complaining, that happens there in the wilderness. And that is where 38 years is spent. And that 38 years, this is really important, that 38 years comes to an end in chapter 20. And it's really subtle, okay? Chapter 20 basically starts by saying, in the first month, Miriam died, okay? And you think, well, the first month of what? Well, as it turns out, it's the first month of their 40th year. So, all right, so chapter 20 is there's almost like there's this massive gap between chapter 19 and chapter 20. Pay attention to that. By the time you hit chapter 20, you are entering the 40-year gap, 38-year gap, talking about the next generation who are going to move on to the promised land when Miriam, Aaron, and eventually Moses dies. Okay, so chapter 20, pivotal point, there in the wilderness, 38 years. And it's not that nothing happened in that time. A lot happened in that time. In fact, Moses, in one of the chapters this week, gives a summary of all their travels. And you're thinking, I've hardly read about any of these places. Okay, that's right. Moses summarizes them in a chapter, but he does actually write them down in a book that we no longer have. You read about that this week. It's really interesting. There's a book called the Book of Wars that Moses records what happened in that 38 years of history, and it's been lost to us over time. We don't have record of it, even though Moses refers to it. All right, so there you go. So chapter 20, they travel again for another couple of chapters, and again, a whole lot of whinging, whining, and complaining goes on, as well as some military conquest, granted, until they get to the plains of Moab. Moab was one of the sons of Lot. Do you remember Lot's, back in Genesis, when Lot's daughters got him drunk and slept with him? A bit of a weird story. Well, Moab, the Moabites, they're distant cousins of God's people. They're in the plains of Moab. They spend 5 months there preparing to enter the promised land. And that's where basically the book and the last good number of chapters closes. And so what you're going to notice toward the end of Numbers is a whole bunch of stuff seems to be repeated. There's a whole chapter or 2 chapters devoted to Passover and all the festivals. And you're like, why is Moses saying that again? He just said that in Leviticus. Like, we made a big deal of that last week. No. He's repeating it here on the plains of Moab because he's speaking to the children of the previous generation. All right, this is the 40-year generation. He's repeating things to them just before they go into the promised land. So yes, there's some repetition this week. Get used to it because there's going to be a whole lot more next week as well. All right, well, this week, of course, we're spending most of our time. We've left Sinai. See you later, Sinai. We're going to spend most of our time in the wilderness and the plains of Moab. And there's a few key things I want you to pay attention to, or a few key characters that deserve special attention this week. Here in the wilderness, we have special attention, of course, to Joshua and Caleb, as was just mentioned, the story of the 2 spies and the 10 spies. Very important characters, a very, very important story. We read that last week. But there's also special attention here in the wilderness given to Aaron and his sons. Okay, you're going to read that this week, that there's a real big emphasis on making sure that the Levites know not all of them are called to be priests. All right, just Aaron and his sons will be priests, and that emphasis really comes about this week because of a guy called Korah from the Levites who tried to, usurp Aaron's place basically, and there you go. So Aaron really gets a mention, and his sons after him perpetually. The priesthood is theirs. Eleazar and Phinehas, you'll meet their names this week. Then in the traveling chapters, all right, there's only 2 chapters, but there's a really key character mentioned there, and his name is Jesus. Now, okay, you don't see his name there, okay, but what you do is we see signs of Jesus. In this traveling stories, we see the story of Moses striking the rock, and we see the story of him lifting up a snake, okay? And both of those things, by the time we get to the New Testament, the apostles say to us, both of those things are signs of Jesus. Jesus himself says, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert, so I will be lifted up. If you look at me, you will be made whole, okay? So pay attention there to Jesus in those traveling chapters. And then by the time we get to the plains of Moab, there's essentially 5 groups of people that got my attention: the sorcerer, the successors, the sisters, the shrinkers, and the splitters. There you go. They're all alliterated for you. It all makes sense as you read, okay? Basically, the first story we come across is a great story about a sorcerer called Balaam. It's a lot of fun. Pay attention to him because he's mentioned again 3 times in the New Testament. That's part of the reasons I'm emphasizing him. Where basically he's asked to curse God's people, but instead he blesses them. He can't help it. He's only going to do the words, give the words that God has spoken to him. But because he can't pronounce curse over them, he just can't bring himself to do it. What he does is he actually deceives them, God's people, into sleeping with Midianite women, and those Midianite women tempt God's people into worshipping foreign gods. It's like, the woman leading Adam to the forbidden fruit. It's this picture that comes up again and again through the scripture. Pay attention to it only because as we keep reading through Israel's journey, this is going to happen again and again and again, especially in the Kings. Foreign wives, okay, encouraging God's people to worship other gods and commit idolatry. Well, it starts right here with the sorcerer Balaam, a really important character as we go. Then we've got the successors, okay. These are basically the people that take over the leadership roles with Aaron and Moses dying, or Moses about to die. Now, Aaron, as we know, the priesthood goes to his sons, Eleazar and then Phinehas. And Phinehas gets chosen because, this is an awesome story, he grabs a spear while an Israelite is having sex with a Midianite woman, and he runs it through both of them at the same time, and God says, "You're the man I want to serve as my priest." So anyway, so there's Aaron's successors, and then Moses, knowing he's about to die, says, "God, what about me? Who's going to be my successor?" Moses did not assume his son would succeed him. God had never said that. So Moses goes to God and says, "Who will succeed me?" And God says, "Joshua. I want Joshua to be the one to take over your place." So really interesting, okay, because Moses is not functioning as a king. You know, in a monarchy, the king hands down leadership to his sons. You always know who's going to be on the throne. It's the prince, okay? The sons, not Moses. Moses goes to God and he says, Joshua, pay attention to that. So we've got the sorcerer, we've got the successors, we've got a couple of sisters. This is a cute little story about sisters whose father didn't leave behind a son. And so God says, although it's against your culture, I want these sisters to inherit their father's land. So a little bit of female rights, women's rights coming about there. Take note of the sisters. Then we've got the shrinkers, okay? This is a little bit subtle, but when they do the second census, the numbers are basically the same. Or let's say this, the ultimate numbers of God's people 40 years later are the same. Pretty well, it's like a 0.3% difference, no big deal. But there is a big deal with one particular tribe, Simeon. Simeon's tribe loses over 60% of its population in those 38 years, while Manasseh, incidentally, gains 60% and kind of balances out the numbers. And so that kind of thing, if you're really paying attention, should get your attention and think, I wonder what it is about Simeon. Well, go back and read what happens in Genesis. Why, when Jacob prays for his sons at the end of Genesis, why would Simeon and Levi be the smallest of the tribes? Why would Simeon go from being the third largest to now the smallest in that 40-year gap? Well, there might be a clue for you there in Genesis 49, that's the shrinkers. And then lastly, we have a group called the splitters, okay? And that's basically 2.5 tribes that come to Moses here on the plains of, where are we? The plains of Moab. On the plains of Moab, they come to Moses and they say, listen, mate, we don't really want to cross into the promised land. We're happy where we are. The farming's great here. Our families are settled here. Is there any way we can stay? And Moses objects at first, but then he actually comes around and he says, listen, okay, you can stay. The 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, you guys can stay on this side of the Jordan permanently. You have to come over the river to fight for us, fight with us, but then when the time is right, you can come back and you can settle here. So this is where the book of Numbers ends. Chad, what's your point? Here's the point. The book of Numbers starts at Sinai, spends 38 years in the desert, ends on the field and the plains of Moab for 5 months as they prepare to go to the promised land. Israel has 13 tribes. One of them is Levi. They're going to be, by the time they have the promised land, they're going to be scattered all through the promised land in different towns and with their own pasture lands, etc. Then we've got 2.5 tribes that are staying on this side, the eastern side of the Jordan River, and aren't going to go through, which means there's 9.5 tribes left that at some point are going to go across the Jordan and into the promised land. Joshua is going to be Moses' successor. He's going to be the one to take them. We're all good and ready to go. Except for us, there's one more book to read. It's the book of Deuteronomy, because Moses feels the great need, okay, speaking to the children of the original Exodus people to remind them of God's covenant. And so next week, we're going to be reading a whole book that's devoted to reminding the kids, okay, who are about to cross into the promised land of the law and the covenant of God. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's not do that yet. Guys, enjoy Numbers. We're sticking in the one book this week. I know you can do it. Have a fantastic week of readings, and I'll catch you, next week. Bye.